Welcome back to Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. We're starting our sort of autumn term now, and a lot has happened this summer. I'm Peter York, and my podcast is about culture wars, disinformation and misinformation stories. It's about the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with dramatic and emotive narratives instead of the real issues. It's about small things blown up to upset and distract people, made-up causes and astroturf organisations invented by PRs and lobbyists, unreal people. I'll be talking to the players and the commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening and what's not happening because it's made up. And then if we can ask some vital questions, a bit of my guest's backstory, how he got into doing all this. Last year, Angus Hanton wrote a remarkable, game-changing book stuffed with extraordinary facts, names and numbers. It's called Vassal State, How America Runs Britain. And it argues that Britain has been bought up and colonised by the US, and that the successive UK governments have allowed it. In fact, encouraged them to do it. Our economic relationship with the US is very different from that of comparable European nations, who simply haven't allowed it. He argues that the huge economic power the US exerts here inevitably affects our politics, how we legislate or don't over America's interests. And he notes how senior UK politicians have had strong US connections for decades. When the book came out last year, in March, April-ish, it was widely and positively reviewed and discussed across the board, from the Telegraph and the Spectator on the one hand to the Guardian and Novara Media on the other. There's even an enthusiastic Daily Telegraph quote on the front page. This year, it keeps on being rediscovered. Clever Aaron Bastani of Novara Media did a second long interview this year on his YouTube channel because he'd so admired it, and he thought it was more relevant than ever. We'll come to exactly why he thought that. There's a real head of steam in this country, right, left and centre, for re-examining what politicians love to call the special relationship, and for asking whether our politicians of all kinds have presented a false prospectus about our place in the world to us. Angus, can you quote what strikes you as the most shocking facts, names and numbers in Vassal State?
Yes, you talked about misinformation and disinformation. I think basically the American situation in Britain is a matter of lack of information. People just don't know how much the Americans control and own. Roughly speaking, they own a quarter of the economy, which is actually far more than it sounds if you consider they're unlikely to control rents or wages. So it's a big chunk of the economy. And loads of brands that we all use and come across all the time are American-owned. So Boots and Costa, Morrison's, Weetabix, Cadbury's, these are all US brands, but they typically don't rebrand them in the American way. So Costa is owned by Coca-Cola. They leave us to believe that they're still British-owned. Of course, the tech brands, which take such a big chunk of the economy, so Amazon and Apple and eBay, Microsoft, we know they're American-owned, but they completely dominate the tech space, and the tech space is expanding and expanding into other areas. I think the other thing is that even companies that are British-owned have a large number of shareholders who are American. So a typical listed company has at least 30% of their shareholders are US organisations or US institutions. That's up from about 3 or 4% at the time when Thatcher was in power. So it's been a steady growth in American ownership of quoted companies, as well as a huge amount of takeovers by US companies. I mean, including since the book was written, there have been several large ones. I mean, one of them is a company that people may not be familiar with, but it's called Spectris. It's a controls company. is worth several £billions, and Apollo and KKR, two big US finance groups, had a bidding war for it, and they're taking it out of the UK stock market. So there's just hugely more control than we recognise. One easy way to measure it is the number of British people who work for American corporations. The establishment always say this is about 1 million, but my research shows that it's over 2 million. So 2 million Brits working for American corporations, and that's including all the Amazon Flex drivers, it's including the Uber drivers, but just many corporations, McDonald's, are employing large numbers of Brits. So it means that their future and their terms and conditions are essentially decided in America. So yeah, it's much bigger than people realise.
So if we take what formerly regarded as the giants of the FTSE, the world-straddling British businesses, say that the two oil companies, BP and Shell, Unilever, Big Diageo in drinks and so on, they're likely to have something like a third of their shareholders as Americans.
Absolutely. And there are many other companies, like, for example, Waterstones, which we think of as a British startup, which is now owned by a private equity company, Elliott. And you think, oh, well, they've got competitors like Blackwell's, but actually Blackwell's are also owned by Waterstones. They just keep the brand separate. One of my favourite activities in the last few years has been, whenever I come across a company, looking up on Google, another American company, and nowadays on ChatGPT, another American company, looking up who owns, and then quote a brand that I've just come across in the UK. And it's significantly more than half the time it's owned by an American company. But as you say, the big UK companies, Shell, BP, Unilever, HSBC, they all have a big chunk of US shareholders.
HSBC, very interesting. Now, Waterstones, it's important in defining a whole group of people, Waterstones man and woman, people, middle-class people across the country in the nicer towns, which can support a Waterstones, who like to keep across books, cultural values, etc. And we think of it as a very British startup. I can remember when it started up, one of its branches started up the road next to me and going there every Saturday because they did the American thing, putting books out on tables. Now you say Waterstones, American-owned, Blackwell's owned by Waterstones. They didn't tell us that, did they?
There was no point at which they needed to. From their point of view, it was a quiet takeover, noticed by people in the city on the finance pages, but there's no big announcement. It's not to their advantage to make a big announcement. It helps them to allow people to continue to believe that the company is British-owned. And that's true, particularly in Europe, where if there's an American company, they definitely don't want people to think of it as American, because there's much more of an anti-American sentiment in Europe in a way that there isn't in Britain. And I'm not trying to create an anti-American sentiment. My book is not anti-American. Many parts of it admire what they've done. My book is about, in a way, I'm not complaining about the lions acting like lions. I'm complaining that we zookeepers, the British, have allowed them to get out of their cages. We ought to be regulating, we ought to be stopping the takeovers, we ought to be making sure they pay tax. So the problem lies with us rather than these red-blooded American corporations.
Now, you say that we are exceptional amongst second-tier powers, meaning European states, really, in having this situation, that it isn't that America has taken over the rest of the world, it's that it's taken over Britain to a quite exceptional degree. Could you spell that one out? And why is it?
Absolutely. We've welcomed them. We've said the more the merrier. We've bent over backwards to allow them to do the takeovers that they've wanted to do. We've allowed them to moderate and sometimes extinguish their tax liabilities. We don't have a rule about foreign ownership in most sectors, and in the sectors that we do, like defence and so on, and telecoms, we've welcomed their takeovers. So it's all about the attitude of the politicians, which has been to some extent echoed by ordinary people who sort of look up to the Americans, think, why not? Why does it matter to us? So that's one reason. And we don't have the kind of cautious approach of the Germans and the French, who have recognised the benefit of controlling their own destiny and owning their own companies.
What are the differences? What's the order of difference between us and, say, France or Germany?
I think the American penetration into the British economy is about 3 or 4 times as much in Britain as it is in France or Germany. And that's illustrated by the number of, it's not the main measure, but it's illustrated by the number of employees.
You were explaining the difference between us and comparable European nations. And I think you at some point say, in fact, I know you do, that Britain has been the beneficiary, or question mark, of the largest chunk of American overseas investment.
Yes.
In absolute terms.
Absolutely. So we're much more of a target, significantly more of a target for US overseas investment than even Canada, which is right next door and you would expect would have a lot more companies owned by the Americans. And we're several times as much of a place where the Americans invest as any other European country. The American investments in Britain represent about the same as in the whole of the rest of Europe combined. So we're a huge landing pad in Europe for them. And of course, we've been very, very helpful to the Americans, not just in terms of welcoming them, but we also represent a gateway for them, an English-speaking gateway into Europe. Brexit or no Brexit, we're still right next to Europe and it's a good place to trade with Europe, despite everything. We also represent a gateway for the American corporations into the Commonwealth and the former colonies. And That's very, very useful to Americans. And typically a takeover by an American corporation of an old established UK company, one of the big advantages to them would be they build up all these links. So, for example, when Kraft took over Cadbury's, it meant that they had all those links with African countries and Far Eastern countries that had been built up over decades at the time when the British had an empire. But that's been a great advantage to the Americans in a way that takeovers of German and French companies are typically not quite so useful.
So one empire taking over another. You quote somewhere an eager early 20th century American saying, we're going to take over Britain, it's inevitable.
Yes. And what he says is, we don't need to take them over militarily. We don't need to take them over explicitly politically. We can take them over in terms of our business ownership and in terms of our trade. We'll crush them economically. And of course, that's led to huge amount of political influence, so that in effect, Britain is subservient politically to the Americans. And we see that all the time. And that's constantly covered up by the sort of fig leaf that Starmer and others like to present of, well, we'll do what we want. In the book Vassal State, I quote an absolute classic case of that when Boris Johnson was talking about Huawei in our telecoms networks. And he said, we'll decide whether Huawei is a danger to our security. The Americans want us to take Huawei out of our networks, but we'll decide whether we need to. And then he consulted all the experts in the UK, and they thought about it hard, and they said, well, there are a couple of networks we need to take Huawei out of, but mostly we should keep them here. And the Americans huffed and puffed, and they threatened, and it was clear that they were working at every level. They were working through it, a group of MPs, they were working through civil servants, and they were working at the top level with Trump in his first term speaking directly to Boris about this. And in the end, the British climbed down completely and said, no, that's what you want, that's what we'll do. And that's true across many, many policy areas. It's just that usually it's not such a public spat. Usually there's a quiet word from the Americans about what they'd like us to do. The British toe the line.
And a lot of it seems to be about the interests of major American businesses in Britain, the way that we tax them, and also the way that we regulate them, the degree of moderation in media businesses and social media.
Absolutely. I mean, last week there was a climb down by the Brits, wasn't there? They had absolutely insisted that Apple should give the security services a backdoor access to Apple's data. And the politicians got involved at the highest level. And in the end, the Brits climbed down and said, no, we can do without that. We'll have access to everyone else's data, but if the Americans want to insist that Apple keep it private, so be it. Well, maybe that was a good thing. Maybe the Americans were right, but it was a clear example of the Brits having to do what the Americans said. So it's about regulation, as you say, and it's very much about taxation. A couple of people that I've spoken to in the private equity field have said quite explicitly that one of the things that private equity typically does when it takes over a company, and bear in mind most private equity is American, one of the things that they do is they exclude paying tax. They can find ways to do that through transfer pricing and through splitting the taken over company into different parts, the property element, the operating element, the part of the company that owns the royalties. And so the British tax base is seriously eroded by the way this takeover process works.
So these firms disappear when they're bought by private equity, acquired by private equity. They disappear into another almost undocumented region and almost untaxed region of the world, a sort of offshore everything.
Absolutely. Unregulated is important and undocumented is important because what happens is when you've got a public company, you can find out a lot about it from its annual reports and its half-yearly or quarterly reports. And the board is answerable to its shareholders and it's answerable to government in a way that a private equity company isn't. So they sort of go dark in a way, these companies, but not in terms of trading. They carry on trading and they often expand and take over more of the country. I mean, one example is the arches across the country. Mostly the railway arches are in London. Those were owned for many years by the British Rail Property Board and then more recently Network Rail. But a recent Conservative government under the Chancellor Philip Hammond decided that they were not well managed and that they would create an auction process and sell them off. And they're now owned by one of the most successful US private equity companies, Blackstone. And so all those arches are owned by Blackstone. And it's a strange arrangement. Basically, the history of it was that the rental income from the arches would contribute towards the railway maintenance. But by taking it in a lump, the government helped itself financially in the short term, but long term, it's not getting that rental income in anymore. So it has to pay for the maintenance out of general taxation.
So my dream of owning a railway arch and setting up a chintzy little business out of a railway arch is gone forever.
Well, you can still rent one.
At a very much higher price, I imagine.
Usually at a higher price, yes. One of the things that Blackstone did was pushed up rents, and that's a typical landlord behaviour. But there's a certain pattern in private equity in general, which is that they cut costs. They tend not to invest very much for the future. They will do some investments. They reduce tax or sometimes eliminate it. And I'm speaking in general about private equity, not about this particular deal. And they push up prices. So they're very much more driven, more financially motivated. It really is. I mean, I know you're a real expert on culture wars, but there is a cultural clash between how we run our businesses in Britain or how we've run them historically and how the Americans run their businesses. They're inclined towards higher borrowing, very focused on profits at almost any expense, and they're more inclined to outsource so that they don't have employees. And this contrasts, I think, with the more traditional British way of doing things, where you have employees to whom you are loyal, and you have a group of what is sometimes called stakeholders, and you represent. Culturally, the American business model is there is only one significant stakeholder, and that's the shareholder, that's the owner.
Yes.
There's a real difference, and that works out in practical ways. And when push comes to shove, it often is a question of what to do about employees in a downturn, whereas British and European companies be more inclined to try and sit it out and keep those employees on. The Americans are more inclined to sack them.
It's interesting that there's a whole raft of 19th century Quaker companies. I say quite explicitly Quaker companies, which had all sorts of concerns and built model towns and model villages and all sorts of things. Cadbury was one such. So too was C&J Clark, established 1825, of Street, Somerset. Now, I think their present owners aren't in fact American. I think they're Thai or Hong Kong Chinese or thing. But this disappearance of a certain kind of high-minded 19th century capitalism has gone almost unremarked.
It has, and one of the aspects of that is what I've called in the book hometown advantage. It's a terrific advantage to any town or city to have a big company based there, and even better if you've got the owners who live there as well. So that applied to Cadbury's at Bourneville in Birmingham, where the company would provide housing, it provide recreation facilities, leisure centres, boating lakes, landscaping. It would have an apprenticeship scheme. Many of the best jobs in the company would be based there, so the research and development jobs, the management jobs. So what happens when it's taken over is that all moves to Chicago, wherever, in this case, it moves to Chicago, where the hometown advantage is still there, but it's in a different place. Another example is Dow Chemical, a US company where the Dow family live in Michigan and they contribute to the art galleries and so on. So hometown advantage is lost. And as you say, in Street in Somerset, Clarks were a very big donor, important part of the local community, and worked hand in hand, even hand in glove with the local authority to make sure that facilities were provided and people were looked after and they had a sort of sense of place. And that's lost when you have these takeovers. And we needn't have allowed these takeovers. The government had the authority and still has. They could say, for example, we want 51% of quoted companies to remain British, or they could say all takeovers are going to be reviewed and mostly they're going to be rejected unless there's a strong economic logic, and even there with conditions. We've just welcomed them in and said, take over what you like. For the last 20 or 30 years, it's been a sort of national jumble sale where we've said to people, come and help yourselves. And particularly since the economic crash of 2009 and during COVID, there were a lot of takeovers of UK companies. Things were going cheap and the Americans could see that they were buying bargains. But some people say, oh, well, every country's got involved. The Chinese are buying as well. But I would say two things about that. First of all, quantitatively, the Chinese have bought far less, probably around 1/10 as much as the Americans. So it's really not comparable in scale. And secondly, the Chinese are more inclined to buy hard assets, properties and so on, whereas the Americans are very often buying what I've called the bridges and the pipes across which the economy operates. So they're more likely to own eBay and Amazon and UK companies that represented the way that people go to market, so that it's a better business in a way, and it's one that gives more control. And we've seen it with Netflix and the various streamers, but it's not just American-grown ones. Sky has been taken over by an American company.
Comcast, yeah.
Yeah. So these platforms mean that the platform is taking a royalty every time a new film is screened. But it's not only that, they have pricing power. We've seen recently increases in what Netflix charge for their subscriptions, but it's been true of other streamers as well. They've pushed up their prices, and they can do so because they recognise that there's a very strong inertia factor. People don't get round to changing, and even if they wanted to change, there are often very few alternatives because they've got monopoly power. And even if there were alternatives and they wanted to change, there are often social or network reasons why they can't. I've subscribed, for example, to Netflix for me and my family. It would be quite an effort to go around and tell the various members of my family that I've desubscribed. So they really benefit from this sort of locked-in element of business. But my general point is that the Americans have been very effective, not only at taking advantage of this jumble sale and buying lots of firms, but in taking control of the bits of the economy, the heights of the economy, the bits of the economy on which everyone depends, the platforms. So that if I rent a cottage in Wales, I'll typically do it through Airbnb, and so a royalty, probably 7% of what I pay, will go over to San Francisco. This is an illustration of when a British person deals with another British person, they're often paying a royalty, often to a West Coast company. It applies in all sorts of areas, eBay and even Amazon. A high proportion of Amazon goods are not coming from Amazon warehouses. They're being supplied by British companies through the Amazon platform to British consumers. And we've allowed that to happen at scale.
Now, the intermediaries in this process, I say intermediaries because there's the city as a whole and investment banks and the old-fashioned ways in which one company buys another. There's also the whole question of private equity. In both cases, the city as a whole and investment banks, am I right in thinking that the leaders in the investment bank community in the city now are overwhelmingly American, and that the main private equity people operating in the UK are overwhelmingly American?
Absolutely. That's true on both those fronts. There are a couple of private equity companies that are British of scale, but that's small in relation to, of the top 10, I think 7 are American, and that's typical of finance as well. And American companies are also dominating the business of holding assets, which is a good business, and managing more passive assets. So Fidelity and Bank of New York Mellon, these have enormous holdings and they take a royalty on the way through. But it's not just the private equity and the finance companies, it's also the lawyers now. London law, corporate law, is becoming more and more dominated by US companies. They've taken, as you would expect, an aggressive approach to capturing the market, and they're very appealing to US clients. A US client who has a US lawyer, culturally, they'll have similar values. Socially, they'll be more likely to mix. But critically for the American client, it's a one-stop shop. That law firm will be able to deal with competition issues in the UK. They'll be able to deal with the financing. They'll be able to deal with doing the business for that company in other European countries. So American law firms have really taken a chunk out of the London market from traditional partnership companies, and they are continuing to grow. They're taking more and more of it.
So if you look, as I do, at the occasionally at the letterheads, the names of grand old British law firms, they seem to have another or yet another name. So it's X and Y and Z and Q, which means they're American owned now.
A lot of them are, yes, absolutely. But also the Americans have been growing organically. Some of them have been growing without takeovers, just by taking more and more business. But they've been growing with their clients.
Yeah.
If Microsoft is taking over a big gaming company, it will be using its own, typically US lawyer. So they've been growing that way as well.
And am I right in thinking that Blackstone's employs or used to employ young George Osborne?
Oh, did it? Oh, I didn't know that. How interesting.
George Osborne certainly worked for Blackstone, but I don't know whether he continues to work for Blackstone. I mean, he worked for Blackstone when, for instance, he was being editor of the Evening Standard. I believe this to be true. Interesting, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And actually, I did a bit of a survey of all recent prime ministers and chancellors and found that almost all of them either had worked for American companies before they came to power in the UK, or subsequently they did work for American companies. Some of them didn't do very much, but even Gordon Brown took a role on an advisory board for JP Morgan, and Theresa May did a speaking tour in America organised by an American company. Those were the least intensive, but someone like Rishi Sunak had worked for Goldman Sachs and other US companies. Indeed, when he first started being Chancellor, he had a green card and seemed to be working towards becoming an American citizen. He owns property on the west coast of the US, and he's very sympathetic towards American interests, and was while he was Prime Minister.
You've described a couple of remarkable conversations with former chancellors, two former chancellors, who appear to have got their definitions wrong about what constitutes valuable investment and of the Nissan variety, and simply buying up British industrial commercial assets, and their numbers wrong.
Yes, one of the things that governments like to do is to encourage inward investment. And
sounds good.
It sounds good. It sounds good, especially if you can get a Japanese firm to move to an area of high unemployment like Nissan, to move to the northeast and on a greenfield or rather brownfield site, set up a car plant, use their management skills, invest in plant and equipment, and employ many local people and manufacture cars which are sold in the UK and across Europe. That is excellent inward investment. It's creating jobs. Nissan pay their way, and it improves the balance of payments to the extent they're selling cars across Europe. Now, that sort of inward investment, or foreign direct investment as it's often called, is totally lumped together with a takeover of a profitable UK company that is also seen as inward investment, even if that takeover does not lead to any more jobs and does not lead to any expansion of the company. It's just lumped together in the same bucket. So Jeremy Hunt, in one of his speeches as Chancellor, was saying very proudly, we've got the record amount of inward investment, $2 trillion over the last few years. And that, of course, was a complete misunderstanding of what was happening. He was trying to imply that we've got a lot of new firms in building new factories. But those figures reflected what was really happening, that we've flogged off a lot of our businesses, especially the profitable ones. So this distinction between foreign direct investment, which is really investment, and sales of assets is not made at all. And I spoke to the Office for National Statistics, and they agreed there was a strong argument for separating these things, and they hadn't done so. They said, oh, people keep asking us to do that. And I'm thinking, well, they would. It's a bit like if you've got a bucket with chalk and cheese in it, you would ask the person with the bucket to separate the two out.
Yes, yes. You also said, in terms of absolute numbers of ownership, British people employed, etc., that both chancellors got it shockingly wrong.
Yes, I had a nice interview with Philip Hammond, who was very helpful to me and very gracious and very informative. He's an effective guy. He was nicknamed Spreadsheet Phil, wasn't he? But that was because he is on top of the numbers in a way that many chancellors haven't been. But this was one number that he wasn't on top of. He said to me, oh, don't worry about this, Angus. The British employ as many Americans as the Americans employ British. It's about 1 million each way. Now, I think his numbers were out of date, and he had been right when he first came across the number, but he was using an out-of-date number, and steadily, with the takeovers and the growth of the tech companies, the balance had changed, so that while the British companies might have been employing almost 1 million people, the Americans were definitely employing at least 2 million Brits. So his numbers were out of date, and I think they're important numbers. But what was absolutely core for me was that they're not measured. I had to work them out from first principles, as it were, from some very basic data that I was able to get hold of. But it's not as if the government care. They don't work out how much of British industry is owned by Americans, indeed by any foreigners, and they don't appear to care. And so when I did a Freedom of Information request to the HMRC and said, do they know, they denied it. And then I pushed them, and weeks later they said, well, we do know, but we're not telling you. And then I was very fortunate, because a man in that department quietly told me that the numbers were available on an obscure page of an American website, the IRS website, and I looked there and the figures are there in full. And the Americans are very good at their numbers and very helpful. And so I could read up that American sales in the UK are 800 billion. There's probably another 100 billion that comes through Ireland and through other countries like Luxembourg, Netherlands, through Amsterdam. There's probably another 100 billion or so. So there's about $1 trillion worth of sales by US companies into the UK. So I could see that, and I could see how many US multinationals are operating here. Just over 1,200 US multinationals making sales to the UK. So we are absolutely being pillaged, is the wrong word, but we're a vassal of the US, by which I mean we're working for their financial benefit and to their instructions. So these are the two senses of by which I mean a vassal, someone who does what he's told, and he does it. His work, the sweat of his brow, as it were, sweat of his back, goes towards the master's benefits.
And you're saying that successive senior politicians and civil servants have been unworried, in fact, endorsed this sort of happy ignorance for a very long time.
They have. It goes back a long way. Many people will remember the Westland-Sikorsky debate between
Heseltine,
which caused Michael Heseltine to resign from the cabinet, and he'd been arguing for a European solution rather than an American solution to the helicopter supply question. So it certainly goes back that far and before, but it's also recent. Just before the Ukraine invasion, the Americans quietly bought up 3 out of the 6 major British defence companies. So Cobham was one of those. That was endorsed and ushered through by senior British civil servants and politicians without any questions asked. I mean, of course, had that takeover been by Chinese companies, they would have asked differently. So our attitude to foreign investors very much depends on not the cut of their jib, but what nationality they are. As it happens, of course, those were bought up very cheaply because it was just before an explosion in defence spending. But defence spending is another area that illustrates this problem now, because you were asking about senior civil servants. So they are very much in the position of deciding who to recommend and what our policy should be in terms of defence procurement. And our defence procurement is very much US facing. So when Donald Trump says you should increase your defence spending, he's not only talking about the Europeans taking more of the burden from the US, he's also talking about more orders for US companies.
Yes.
Boeing and Northrop and so on, selling their weapons to Europe as well. So it's only the kind of the burden sharing that is publicised. But I would ask about where the defence money is spent. And it's spent quite heavily on the west coast of America, where, of course, California has a huge defence industry. But not only the west coast, across America, defence industry is very big and very profitable.
Now, the really massive questions that people will be asking themselves are about mainstream international politics and the degree to which American ownership of this country allows them to exert a unique influence on our politicians. So when our politicians of both sides are much more supportive of the American line with, say, Ukraine or Gaza, does it reflect the economy?
Absolutely it does. I don't know if you saw that film a few years ago called Dagenham, about the influence of Ford on Dagenham, and it portrayed very well the discussion between the Ford company and the British government, and they were able to get the terms that they wanted. But I think more broadly, the politics follows economics. Trump in particular is more than capable of using economic levers to achieve his political objectives. And we've seen that with tariffs, haven't we? That he's often linked tariffs to people doing what he wants politically. So I think it's perfectly plausible and feasible that if Starmer stepped out of line on some of those foreign policy issues that you've mentioned, that Trump would say, oi, oi, I do respect you, despite everything, and I've given you a low tariff, but I've decided now to increase it because you're not towing the line on Gaza or any other area where the Americans have a clear policy. It's sometimes said in the Foreign Office that when there's a general question about policy, the first thing that the Foreign Office person asks is, what would the Americans want? Now, that may be a caricature, but this isn't me making that up. I've read that that's how some Foreign Office officials think, and it probably makes sense to at least know what your major allies' views are. My argument is that having asked what they are, they then comply with them.
Now, your book has had, to me anyway, a very fascinating second life, second bounce this year, that people are continuing to discover it and take notice of the morals implicit in it. Why do you think that is?
Trump, to use a 5-letter word. I think it's become apparent to people that Trump, not only do the Americans have effective control over Britain, but they're now exercising the control. And the way Trump does it is quite brutal and unsophisticated, and is also quite public. He's a showman, isn't he? He likes to put things on Truth Social. He likes to have events at the White House. He likes to invite people over and have the television cameras in there. It's very different from a typical US president. So I think people have got interested in the book because they've seen the truth of it, the general principle that we are a vassal state. They've seen it because Trump has demonstrated it in a way that others haven't. Before Trump was elected, I wrote the book. As you say, it precedes him. And one of the things I wrote that I think has got people interested was that if Trump got elected, the gravest risk is what would happen to the UK if ever the US were to break with the values shared between our two countries for the past century. How would we respond to a Trump presidency that turned its back on the rule of law and worked much harder to erect trade barriers and shrank NATO and prompted ever closer relations with the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin at the expense of Ukraine? So that was kind of slightly, as it turns out, slightly foreseeing of what I feared would happen. And it seems to me that people are realising that we're subject to the Americans, but it's dangerous to rely on them in the way that we've done. It's unfortunate that this doesn't seem to have had much impact yet on the way that Starmer and the new Labour government operate. I mean, we all want the best for any government. I mean, I sent a copy of the book to all 400 Labour MPs asking for comments and didn't get a single one back.
Blimey.
But it seems to me that Starmer is very, very much the Atlanticist, very closely aligned to Trump, and he sees that as the main chance. He doesn't see a route for expressing independence and getting closer to Europe. So the book is a warning, but it's not a warning that's being heeded by the government at the moment. But I think, as you say, many commentators are looking at it and thinking, yeah, this is a real problem, that we are so subject to the American political whim.
What can we do?
What should we do? Probably do three things, principally. We should, as every researcher would say, we should get more information. We should measure more. We shouldn't just guess about it. We shouldn't rely on an author to dig out the answers. The government should have a proper process for measuring how many companies are and how much the economy is US owned. Of course, that isn't doing anything as such, but it's a start. You need a diagnosis before a cure. Secondly, we should stop the takeovers. We should say we want to own our own companies. And linked to that, we should make sure that all these US companies are fully paying their tax, like UK companies, that they're paying 25% of profits. And that means a very strict reduction of allowing transfer pricing. That is a way where big US companies transfer their profits offshore, so it ends up looking like their UK subsidiary isn't making a profit, which we know in most cases it's making a handsome profit. And thirdly, and this is perhaps the most controversial, we need to be more European, and that probably means getting closer to Europe, and it might even mean rejoining the EU. But certainly we should take a more European. I mean, I'm not too concerned whether we join the EU as such, but we need to take a European outlook on these issues, and we need to partner with the Europeans, and we need to prefer to, both economically and politically, to be in partnership with countries that are 20 miles away and not 2,000 miles away. So it seems to me mildly absurd that we're partnering across the Atlantic when we could partner across the English Channel. What with all the issues around Ukraine, the Europeans, I think, are quite keen to have more partnership from the Brits. I'm slightly surprised, actually, that Europeans are so patient with us, because we were a pretty awkward member of the EU. But whatever the reasons, they are willing, it seems, to continue to work with us, and we should be working with them, turning our attention and our efforts and our partnerships much more towards Europe than we do towards the States. And that's not anti-American, that's just rational and regional. I mean, there are three great blocs in the world, aren't there? There's the Asians, the Americans, the Europeans. And it seems odd for us not to be in the European bloc and to try to be in the American bloc, a bit like when George Osborne was trying to partner with China. That was equally odd.
It's ironic, isn't it, that the watchword, the catchphrase of the Leave movement was take back control. Of course, the Leave movement is very, very heavily engaged with right-wing America and with Russia.
Yes, absolutely. Well, what we've done is we've taken back control only to hand it to the Americans. And that's a bit of a tragedy. But I think it is reversible. But it's probably not going to be reversed by Nigel Farage, who, as you say, is very closely associated with, or perhaps, I think certainly you didn't say, perhaps you were implying, is closely associated with American politics and American values.
And with Donald Trump.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, one fascinating thing that I saw in the utterly enviable by me as a writer, publicity and response to your book across the board. There was lots and lots of it, and it was very admiring for the most part. One exception to this was that, as far as I could work out, there was absolutely no response from our national broadcaster. The BBC did not pick it up.
I've been very surprised and disappointed by that. The publicist of the book, a wonderful woman called Ruth Killick, tried and tried. She didn't exactly batter down their doors, but she gave them plenty of opportunities, different programmes, and she was very pleased, as you say, that the book appealed to left and right and got such good reviews. But on the other hand, the BBC didn't take it up, and maybe it's just bad luck. Maybe it's just that the book wasn't what they wanted at the time. But I think it's partly because they are so dedicated to an Atlanticist view. They are very happy to report American actions almost universally positively. They're very reluctant to criticise American companies. Of course, they do imply some criticism of Trump sometimes. And I think their focus is very much on the other big English-speaking countries. If the BBC were run by a German or a Frenchman, I suspect there would be a more positive response to the book.
I noticed that my last book, back in 2020, with Paddy Barwise, who was a business school prof, was about the enemies of the BBC. It was called The War on the BBC. And we are and remain critical friends. But occasionally there are very startling omissions that the BBC makes. It doesn't tell lies, but it simply doesn't mention issues that are burning away to left and to right of them. How does that happen? It's quite extraordinary. Now, Angus, thank you very, very much indeed. It is a remarkable book. It deserves a lot more discussion and discussion at every level. And I think you're perfectly capable of generating that. I wanted to go on and talk more about you and how you got there, because you're not a regular commentator geek, are you? You've got a life, so to speak.
That's very kind of you to say so, Peter. I think you and other commentators have very much also got a life, and in fact are very well plugged into what's going on in our society. And my background has been having read PPE at Oxford, so mostly economics. I kept up with my economics, but then I built up a couple of businesses, one of which is about conservation and planting trees and looking after woodlands, and another one was in the sort of tech field. But through all this, I came across lots of American corporations, and I was able to sort of see how they operated. Sort of watching from the sidelines, I saw that. And I think, in a way, coming at it as someone who's not an academic and who's not a journalist, I think I wasn't so taken in, as it were. I was able to look, as it were, from the outside and with fresh eyes at the issues. But initially, actually, I only started the book because I asked an innocent question. I just said, how much of the UK is controlled by the Americans? And I thought I'd be able to go online and look up the answer and find that there was a regular government report answering these questions. But I was so wrong. It wasn't just that they didn't know, they didn't care, and they hadn't even begun at any stage to think about it. So that's what really got me interested and got me fired up to think, well, I ought to research it. And having researched it, or started the research, I thought, well, this is ought to be of general interest. We all ought to know how much they influence us and how much the special relationship is especially controlling. And so that's really what drew me into it. But I did have another advantage, Peter, that I'd worked as a volunteer for a think tank called the Intergenerational Foundation, a small London-based think tank, which researches and campaigns for younger and future generations, because our generation has taken so much, haven't we, in terms of final salaries, not in my case, but in general, in terms of benefiting from house price appreciation, not worrying too much about spending money on the economy. We've had good jobs. And the whole tax system has been not rigged, but has been set up in our favour so that we pay very little tax on unearned income because we can shelter it so well
in property
or in pension schemes or in ISAs. There are lots of ways where we can get income at very low tax and capital gains at very low tax, whereas young people pay a very high rate of tax on earned income because they also pay national insurance and very often their student loan payments. So they often pay fairly low earnings levels. They often pay 40 or 50% tax. So I've been campaigning around those issues for 15 years. And one of the results of that is that I've got a sense of how Westminster works. And I've got to meet a lot of MPs, ministers, lords and journalists, think tankers, civil servants. And so I felt comfortable in relation to Vassal State, looking into this space and knowing who to ask. And so that was a great help. But I only helped set up the Intergenerational Foundation as a kind of a campaign because I thought it was such an important issue. But it had this additional benefit of making me think about how Westminster works, or in many cases doesn't work.
Many cases doesn't work. I'd love to bang on about the influence of opaquely funded right-wing SW1 think tanks and the whole history of them going back to Sir Anthony Fisher in 1955, because it is a very, very fattening process, because at the end of that process is the Heritage Foundation Project 2025.
Absolutely, yes.
What fun that would be. I'd love to have another conversation about all these things. But in the meantime, Angus Hanton, author of Vassal State, thank you very much for talking.
Thank you, Peter.
My thanks to Angus Hanton, author of Vassal State, How America Runs Britain. Now, in the next episode, we'll be talking to another fascinating guest. Culture Wars House Party is presented by me, Peter York, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do listen in again. Goodbye.